Welcome to the Hud Grad Club. I'm Chris Webb, and I'm the Alumni Engagement Career Consultant with the University of Huddersfield's Careers Employability Service. And, full disclosure, I'm also a University of Huddersfield graduate. So I've generally got pretty positive things to say about both the institution and any of our graduates. But don't take my word for it. In this podcast, we'll be meeting different members of the University of Huddersfield's global alumni community, finding out what makes them tick, about their experiences during their time at the university and their career journeys since completing their studies. Join us as we explore the inspiring, innovative and diverse range of individuals that make up the Hud Grad Club. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Hud Grad Club. And James, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for joining us. Now, for those viewers who maybe don't know you already, can you tell us a little bit about your background, what you studied at the university and what it is that you're doing now?
Of course. So I grew up in Surrey, down south. As you can probably tell from my accent, I am not northerner. I was interested when I was growing up in web design. I was also interested in radio. So I started kind of getting a bit of work experience working for local radio stations. And actually, originally, I wanted to be a DJ. But I kind of looked at the industry and thought, you know what, it's quite hard to crack. And this web stuff this was back in the sort of mid 2000s, is growing and taking off. And surely there's more money to be made when you go into a career if you go into tech. So I started looking at degrees, and I came across this degree called Interactive Multimedia. And Huddersfield was one of a few universities that seemed to offer it, really specific. And now it's just called web design, BSc web design. Mine was BA Interactive Multimedia. But back then, multimedia and interactive was kind of I suppose it was probably a term that kind of rolled over from like the late 90s. But really, it was a fancy term for web design. So it's a kind of bit of a kind of broad degree in that you learned graphic design, you learn a bit of code, you learned a bit about the theory of e-commerce and things like that. So it really appealed to me because I wasn't quite sure at that stage really what I was going to do when I graduated, but I'd started using a computer to kind of explore various different entrepreneurial paths. And one of the things I'd done was I'd set up a small business selling streaming media services to radio stations. And I actually set that up just before I started university, and I went to uni. And the cool thing was, by the time I started uni, I sort of almost had my part-time job, if you like. And we'll kind of discuss this in more detail. But since then, I've gone on to sort of start a number of different businesses, primarily all in the audio space and looking at radio and podcasts and things like that. And yeah, it's been a great journey ever since I've graduated. You know, things have come on really well, and I think for me, going to Huddersfield was really interesting. It's sort of, I think going to university generally gives you a great opportunity to, explore different paths. And that's kind of exactly what I did.
That's great, James. I know we're going to kind of dig into your path a little bit more sort of as we move through the podcast. But as always, we start the podcast with our first section, which is the greatest Hud story ever told. So we are looking into your memories from your time at the university, kind of any key things that sort of stood out to you. So are there any kind of particular, I guess, memories you'd want to share from your time at the university?
But I mean, do you know what? There's a lot, and there's a lot of stories that I probably don't want to tell on a podcast. Because that's what you should do while you're at university, right? But I think from a kind of keeping things focused on career and stuff, I think for me a big turning point was when I got involved in a scheme which was run by the university, and I was set up in kind of like a co-working space at the time. It was called a business incubator, and got involved with some other people who started businesses, and they were great. They were great for me developing as an entrepreneur. They were great for my confidence because they were all a little bit older than me at the time. And there were some big personalities in there, and it was a lot of fun. We worked hard, but we also messed around quite a lot in the office, so it was really fun. And there's some funny stories. I remember, if you want something crazy, one of my colleagues, who I'm still very good friends with now, at the time, Phil, he had another tech business, and I was away from the office. I'd gone home or something for a couple of days, and he decided to get in I just bought this brand new chair. So he decided, and I had a cactus on the side of the desk, and you can see where maybe this is going. He decided to strip off completely naked and sit in my chair with this cactus, covering his private parts, and take a photo and send it to me while I was home. So there we go. That's one to kick you off.
That is, yeah, that is certainly that's up there with the best from that section so far.
There is many more, trust me, many more.
And I mean, you mentioned there, obviously, significant kind of amount of your, I guess, time, was sort of spent in the incubator with some of the stuff that you're doing with the business, which we're going to come on to. Were there any other kind of key people that you sort of from your time, I guess, at the university that you wanted to give a bit of a shout out to while we're reminiscing?
I want to say hi to Michael O'Grady, who's still there, still lecturing within the computing and engineering department, to my knowledge. And Michael O'Grady was great. He was kind of my personal tutor throughout the latter half of university. So I did a sandwich degree, so placement year, and rather than going working for another company, I worked for myself for that sort of placement year. And he was really supportive of that, and he was the one who'd come out and do the kind of on-site visit, which was kind of weird for him because normally they're used to going and speaking to someone's boss. Well, when you're in your own boss, they're kind of just talking to you. So how's James doing? And I'm like, yeah, he's doing great.
Bit of a handful, yeah.
yeah. He was always really supportive of kind of what I wanted to do, even though at the time it was kind of a little bit, I suppose, out of the kind of the normal mold of what they kind of expected placement students to do. And this placement advisor, she was kind of just not really on the same page as him, and she was kind of like, I don't understand how we can fit you in. We haven't got a proper syllabus for this, or whatever it might have been. And eventually they figured out a way of letting me do what I want, which was great.
No, I mean, that's great to hear. And I think what's nice, I suppose, to people who are kind of watching the podcast now, who are, either involved currently in the university or current students, is we see this now perhaps a lot more commonly with the enterprise placement year and the work that the enterprise students doing. So, you were very much, by the sound of things, a forerunner, in that sort of model.
I like to think so, Chris. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's stop the flattery now. So this leads us really nicely, I guess, onto kind of, that sort of journey that you mentioned earlier, that transition from sort of leaving the university to kind of what you're doing now. And I guess sort of normally or typically on the podcast, we're talking about people maybe finishing the degree and transitioning into the world of work and what that was like. But I guess for you, it's been a slightly different journey because, as you said, the business was sort of there even before you started. It was kind of developed during your time at the uni, and then you're still doing the same thing now, or a much more developed version of what you were doing then. So, tell us a little bit more about what's that journey kind of looked like, and how's it sort of led you to where you are right now?
Yeah, I kind of touched on it briefly earlier. So the full story is, I kind of left sixth form, and I was always fascinated. My dad was an antiques dealer, and he had a lot before that. When he was growing up, he had lots and lots of different jobs. And so when we were kids, he'd always say to us that going and starting his business was the best decision he ever made because it gave him so much more freedom. Because I grew up down south, a lot of my friends' dads worked in London. Right. So they'd be working. They wouldn't be home till 11 o'clock at night. They wouldn't see the kids until the weekend, all that sort of thing. And my dad just had this freedom. If he wanted to come to sports day, he could do. If we were not feeling well at school, and he could come and pick us up. And it was great. So he's got to sort of spend more time with us. And I think he just sort of said, it's just given me this freedom, this lifestyle that like, a lot of your friends' dads just don't have because they're sort of stuck in the corporate machine, so to speak. And that kind of appealed to me. So, it was never sort of expected you should follow on my footsteps. But I think that really encouraged me to sort of start looking at other ways to earn a living. And when my friends were going out and getting part-time jobs, and this is what a lot of people do at university, you want to make ends meet. You got your student loan to rely on, but especially now more than anything, it's got a lot more expensive to go to university than when I did. And obviously with everything going up in price around us, cost of heating and, food and all sorts of stuff. It kind of, at the time I was thinking, well, I want to be, making a sort of side hustle. That's what they call it now, side hustle. I want to be making a living without having to go and working in, somewhere like McDonald's, for example, which there's nothing wrong with working at McDonald's, but I thought, that's kind of what I want to do. So that was kind of like the first driver for me. And as I say, by the time I started uni, I was probably making, I don't know, maybe like a few £100s a month, something like that. But it was enough to sort of give me a nice supplementary income for my student loan, and I kind of was kind of, I suppose, in a sense, a little bit of a rich student because I didn't really ever have to worry about paying my bills or anything like that. Which was great, good position to be in. I could kind of go out when I wanted, within reason. I could go shopping and all that sort of stuff, and buy some nice clothes and things. And then I think when I was at university, I sort of continued with that. And as I say, I tried various different ideas. I sort of started off designing websites and things when I was 16, 17 and doing logos for local businesses. And I was still sort of doing a little bit of that while I was at university. But as I say, one of my passions was radio, and I was really wanting to go into radio initially, as on-air talent, as a DJ. And I still, throughout university, loved music, and sort of still do, but I was looking at ways to kind of monopolize on this interest, my hobby, if you like. And I kind of thought, well, let's look at the internet landscape and see if I can build a solution for radio broadcasters who want to stream online. And there was a couple of tools out there, but they didn't really make it very easy. And so that's what I kind of did while I was at university. I kind of built that business. And then obviously by the kind of time you get to your placement, you're kind of conscious, well, making sort of say 600-700 quid a month is great, but it's not going to be enough to live off when I graduate. So I need to go and grow this to a point where I'm earning a full-time living. So that's kind of what I focused on doing in that placement year, scaling the business to a point where I was at least going to be in a position where then when I graduated, didn't need to go and find a job. Did that very successfully to the point where really I was kind of questioning if I should even go back for final year. And that was a bit of a tricky decision for me, because I was probably making then a good living by the end of my third year. And I thought, do I really need a degree now? I've got this business set up and it's doing pretty well, and I had my own office, and I was sort of starting to think about hiring my first member of staff at the time. And that was a big leap. I was sort of too scared to take it while I was still studying, but I thought, well, do you know what? I've come this far, so I might as well finish. And it was tricky in final year trying to balance the two, actually.
Yeah, and I was going to say, were you able to kind of continue, perhaps not at the rate you'd done during the placement year, but were you able to continue the business sort of as you moved through the last year of your degree?
Yeah, I think now I look back on it, I probably put it on hold a little bit, in the sense that it didn't develop as much as it had done in my sort of placement year. And then it probably didn't start developing further until I graduated, and I could sort of refocus on it. But I kind of kept it afloat, so it kind of probably didn't grow, but it was a good level. And as I say, I then graduated, and I stayed in Huddersfield for an extra year because my partner at the time was still at university. And then we moved to Manchester, and that was when I kind of focused on growing the business to a point where, I sort of took on my first member of staff not long after. And within a year, I'd had sort of 3 or 4 staff, and things really took off.
And were there kind of, I guess, sort of light bulb moments along the way where, you really sort of felt like, yeah, actually this is definitely the direction of travel I'm going to take? Or from what you were saying, was that sort of always something kind of inherent, growing up, that you thought, yeah, this is probably the route I'm going to take, but I'm not sure how I'm going to take it yet?
Trying to, it's quite a while ago. I'm trying to remember now. So I think it was a little bit inherent. I was always fascinated. And if I hadn't been able to make that business work, I'd have tried something else. And actually, now I think about it, I came up with like in probably in the final year, I was or maybe even during placement, I was sort of coming up with different ideas. And because I was sharing office, I moved in with a couple of other companies after I moved out of the business incubator. So we were all kind of bouncing ideas around, and we were all very entrepreneurial. So we all had the next biggest idea. We were all kind of like one-man bands, but it was quite a fun environment to be in. And that's the thing. I kind of had it was sort of like I had my student life and then my professional life, and I pretty much was at the office. When I wasn't in lectures, I'd be at the office, and of course, you tend to have like a couple of days where you have no lectures at all. So really I was almost working full time whilst trying to balance my degree. And I remember doing, working till 11 o'clock at night and probably thinking to myself, God, why am I doing this? But, now I look back on it, I understand that sort of hard work, the slog that I put in back then has probably paid off now. And, business is never like the whole idea of getting rich quick or having this overnight success. It's very, very rare. A lot of people have put in significant hours before they can kind of really reap the benefits, become very wealthy. And I think I was sort of no exception. I had to work really, really hard, and I was making an okay living when I graduated, but I was definitely not rich by any stretch of the imagination. But then a couple of years later, things took a turn and turned out I ended up striking a deal with AOL, which were, maybe not as prominent now, but at the time, they're a big firm in the internet space, huge company. So I flew to New York, went to have a meeting with them. And that was, that's a story for another time. In fact, there's other podcasts where I talk a lot more about that, but it was that was one of those moments that really changed my life. And I put in the groundwork in the former years while I was at university, and that probably was 2000 and a couple of years after I graduated. So 2011 or 12, I think. 2012, that deal came around. So it's interesting. But I think in terms of going back to your question, light bulb moments, I guess it was the point where I finished my placement year and I was like, I don't need to go finish my degree if I don't want to. And realizing that, wow, okay, I've now got I've sort of set this business up, and this is a proper business now, not just kind of this thing where I'm like I'm messing around on the internet, which again, it was funny because when I first started, I was telling a lot of my I lived in Stores Hall in first year, which was a great experience. And, a lot of people there I was chatting to, you meet lots of people on nights out and your flatmates and stuff. They had literally, I was like, I could have had two heads. I was, don't tell me about this. So you've got this computer and you're making money on it. How does that work? As in, back then it was such a foreign concept to people. It wasn't, it was just no one else was doing it, so. Yeah, it was kind of interesting, and to begin with, I thought maybe I am a little bit crazy, but now, but then, sort of probably by the end of the degree, it was. I think people were a lot more aware of that type of stuff, and
I mean, you mentioned there sort of the benefits, generally of kind of entrepreneurialism, and I think sometimes, we perhaps kind of find that people kind of maybe veer away from the idea of getting involved with any sort of enterprise type activity if they don't feel they want to set up a business or go freelance. I mean, do you think that there's, if you look at something like the placement year that you did, for example, are there kind of inherent benefits in undertaking or experimenting with that type of activity, even if you're not sure you want to go?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely, massively. University is the perfect time to do it because number one, it's not like when you can mess up and it's fine. There was other things I tried while I was at uni, businesses that I had ideas and stuff that just didn't go anywhere. And there was some stuff which I look at and thought, actually, if I stuck with that, it might have gone somewhere. But maybe it was too soon or whatever. But it's the perfect time because you've got your student loan. You can always go out and get a job. Worst comes to worst, or your parents can help you out. And you'll never have that opportunity again in your life, really, because as soon as you finish uni, unless you move in back at home, which some people do, and I certainly didn't want to do that. I was very much just like, no, I've moved away from home. I'm sort of independent now, so that was never going to be an option for me. You're on your own, and you've got to either go and get a job to make ends meet, or have some other source of income, like I did. So I think you've got 4 years if you're doing a placement degree. So that's a lot of time to kind of play around with ideas, and at least you should have a good idea by the end of it if it's a goer or not. So I think that's. But then a lot of people go into industry, and there's nothing wrong with doing this, because some people want to get that experience. I think there's the interesting thing with me is I never really had a job ever, so I never really properly had a job working for anyone. Not many people could say that, actually. But it was but as a result, when I did start building a business, I kind of didn't really understand like the rules of work and how to. I kind of sort of threw the rule book out, and I suppose I ran it differently. And people would come and work for me, and they would be like, "Wow, you're so relaxed, and you just let me do what I want." Like, well, I've always been a big believer in the way I run my business now is to hire people who are going to have autonomy and bring something to the table rather than trying to micromanage everything. But yeah, it's university was a good time to kind of get into that space, I suppose.
And it's really interesting to hear that, because I think so often, particularly when we talk about kind of career development, maybe with students, recent graduates, we're talking a lot about kind of being a job taker rather than a job creator. And I think it's really interesting to hear a different version of that. As you said, someone who's maybe not taken a job, but has kind of only really been in the position of creating your own work. So I mean, it's really interesting to sort of hear that reflected. You talked earlier about kind of significant people, I guess, at the university, such as Michael O'Grady, who you mentioned. Are there any other kind of significant sort of figures, I guess, so far in your career to date that have also been quite important, I guess, on the journey, particularly as you mentioned that you haven't worked directly for someone. So I wondered, have there been role models that have helped along the way?
It's not particularly. The people always ask me this, so who's your, who did you look up to? It wasn't really. I always admired Steve Jobs. Again, it was cool to go through the iPhone was launched whilst I was at uni, right? And Apple was just taking off. It was becoming a thing. And like I started university and I was really like Windows based. And by the end of it, I was a proper Apple fan. And it was like, and everything we were taught at uni was on Windows. I imagine that might have changed now. I don't know. But it was for, everyone in tech really works on Mac now. And that was the time where that was, they were doing the keynote launches and the iPad was launched around the time I graduated and stuff. And that was really exciting to watch, and I was like, wow, this guy is just like such a good talker. He's really good at taking like kind of complex products and effectively just describing in a really simple way to a mass market. And I think that's quite important in business, to have those communication skills and to be a good presenter and to be a good salesperson and understand marketing. And those were the things that when I started uni, I wasn't. I was probably a bit of a nerdy kid, and I didn't really. I kind of knew about, I learned to code and I sort of knew how to build websites. I didn't really understand marketing too well and sales, and I sort of in the end learned that probably kind of after I graduated, and that's kind of what allowed me to really take things to the next level, because I was great. I'd learned to build products and turn ideas into kind of usable interfaces on the internet. That sounds awful. But just basically writing the code and designing the website to power it all. And, that's kind of what my degree was about anyway, So, but then I actually then saying, well, we've got this great system to do X. Come and buy it. I had no idea how to do. So that was sort of something I had to learn afterwards. And that wasn't really part of my degree either. So, but then again, that's where networking is useful. I mentioned earlier, I was sort of in a shared office environment with other entrepreneurs, and some of them were way better salespeople than I was at the time. And I watched them on the phones, like talking to people, and I'd be like, oh, I wish I could do that. And it was really useful being in that environment, just learning from people.
And I think, like you said, it comes back to that sort of benefit of that experimentation at university. If you've got access to things like an enterprise hub, an enterprise team, other entrepreneurs doing things, you get that, I guess, broad experience where maybe you've got a skill set, they've got a skill set. There's a bit of shared learning kind of going on.
It's absolutely a peer support group, because this is the thing, if you're starting a business, you might be a great graphic designer, or you might be a really talented, programmer, or be really good at sort of like UI design or whatever it might be. And I was kind of a little bit of a jack of all trades, master of none. And for example, I've not written code now for probably 10 years because I have a team of developers who are way better than I ever was. But I learned enough about it when I was studying and just through my own sort of self development, that I kind of, when I started hiring developers, I knew what they were talking about and I could kind of describe. So it gave me that technical skill set, which I think is really important as a founder. And a lot of founders don't have, so I think that's kind of given me the edge over the years. But as I say, not the best coder in the world. Absolutely. I'll put my hands up. But probably when I was at uni, I thought I was, but actually when I went out into the real world and started hiring people, I was like, God, this guy's amazing. Like John, who's now my CTO, and I hired him, I'm going to say about 10 years ago, just out of college. And he was at the time, he was great and way better than me. And I said, well, come and work with me. And, he's kind of climbed the ranks, and say now he's our CTO and has quite a substantial team working underneath him or alongside him, as I prefer to say, really. But it's great watching people develop, and I think get stuck into as much as you can. If you want to be an entrepreneur, try and learn a little bit of everything. Again, university is a great time to do that, whether it's through your degree or through other students that you meet, and or people who are part of enterprise programs, etc.
Fab. I mean, that's great advice already there, James. And it leads really nicely kind of onto the last section of the podcast, which is our underrated careers advice section. So, I mean, we've already kind of touched on, I think, quite a few of those sort of insights and advice you've got to share from your sort of experience so far. Are there any other kind of particular sort of nuggets that you feel are really useful for either kind of current students or graduates from university that I guess you've learned through your sort of career journey today?
Yeah, okay. Because a couple of them, I was just referring back to our notes here because I couldn't remember what I said when we talked about this. But the first thing which I mentioned, which isn't on the notes, is perseverance is key. So I for many years when I was at uni, I had a business, and I remember being frustrated at some points because I was doing okay, but it wasn't really, my ambitions were much larger than what I was achieving. And at the time, I wasn't really sure how I was going to really kind of get there. In terms of the business, it was just me on my own. I was really just juggling lots of stuff all at once, doing many things. And I kind of thought, firstly, I want to start hiring, but I didn't really have any money to hire people. And nowadays you go and get investment. That's kind of the norm for a lot of tech companies. But back then I was like, just want to do this organically. So that was kind of like a problem. So perseverance, really important. You've got to stick at it. Things don't always take off overnight. I probably worked hard at the business for probably 5 or 6 years before things would, what you consider to be really like, oh wow, this guy's successful. And that's partly, that's because I was at university and I was doing lots of other things, studying my degree and enjoying myself, etc. But then also, things don't just happen overnight. Even now, when we start new businesses, like for example, we launched a production agency called Q at the start of this year. So it's nearly been a year. I think we launched it in February time, and it's kind of only now kind of starting to get the momentum I wanted, and even now I get frustrated by that. So perseverance, you've got to stick at it. If something doesn't happen straight away, you've got to stick at it. You just got to believe in yourself. The second thing, which is the thing we talked about prior to the recording this, was this kind of the concept of the university bubble. I think I still see this because sometimes I do a bit of lecturing here in Manchester at Salford for the broadcast degree. And when people present out their ideas, so we kind of have this module called audio entrepreneurs, and the idea is people come up with an idea for like a radio station or a podcast that they want to build, and a lot of students will be pitching ideas which are like a podcast for students or radio station for students. And when you're in uni, there's this kind of bubble, which I think it was great because I was very much in this little bubble, and it kind of, when you're at uni, your sort of mates at uni and stuff, it's very different to the outside world. You are in this sort of this little weird bubble, and I think understanding that there's life outside that's so important, and going out and getting, networking, like I mentioned, meeting other people. Doesn't have to be other students, but going out meeting other people in the business community. And I had, like, when I was at Huddersfield, probably loads of meetings with like other entrepreneurs. Some of them were just, I can have a meeting, I just want to come and see what you do, because I was aware of people who had other businesses. There was a guy who built a games company. They were making like early mobile games, basically, like, and he got a small team working for him. And at the time I was like aspiring to be like that. I was like, wow, this guy's killing it. And he was maybe a few years older than me. He might have been like mid-late 20s at the time. And I was just wanted to go and see in his office and see ask him and sort of pick his brains. And more than often, people will be happy to say yes if if there's someone you aspire to be like, or you're interested in what they're doing and you want to learn from them, and you just send them an email, just say, listen, I'm interested in what you're doing. I know you've got similar business to what I want to do, or whatever. People, and I'm a student at the moment, they don't see it as a threat. They'll just say, yeah, sure, come in and have a chat. So that's important to do, and get some, because if you being an entrepreneur sometimes can be quite a lonely place, because you're kind of responsible for your destiny, which can be great, and people think, oh well, it means you can do whatever you want when you want. It's like, well, yeah, but I have to work hard to achieve that, as well. And it's funny because when I meet people at parties and stuff now, and tell them my story, and they're like, oh, that's great, does that mean you can just do whatever you want? I'm like, well, sort of, but then also I've got a lot of responsibility. I've got like 45 people on my payroll now, so if I kind of just do what I want and don't work, then they're not going to be very happy. It's funny because that's sort of like, you take on those responsibilities as you grow as an entrepreneur.
And I think it's really interesting that you've kind of said all that, because actually, like, thinking about the point there, I suppose, around sort of getting out the bubble, but kind of being curious. And I suppose really what sometimes gets referred to as commercial awareness, which is often very vague and nebulous. But what we really mean is seeing the bigger picture, like you're saying, what are other people doing? What's happening in industry at the moment? What are some of the developments that startups are working on? What things are you interested in? Is there any way that can kind of coalesce? So
that's exactly it. Being, as I say, an entrepreneur, if you don't have an awareness of what's going on in your industry, it can be negative. And it's easy to get really obsessed with the competition, for example, but you've got to sort of have this kind of single-mindedness to be better than them, because otherwise, if you just copy everything your competition's doing, you're not just building a business which is the same as theirs and will never progress beyond that. So I've always been quite good in sort of, having that self-belief and thinking, right, we're going to do things our way versus try and do things someone else's way. But there's also that thing where, it's good to understand, speak to potential customers, or potential suppliers of a business. Even if you're thinking about starting something, let's say, you've got an idea for a business, you want to start something, but you've not done anything. The first place to start is just go and speak to, do some market research, but on the ground. Because again, like you say, commercial awareness, and a lot of forgive me for saying this, I'm sort of not having go academics here, but a lot of academics live in like data. They'll look at like, you know, trends and graphs, all that sort of stuff. Sometimes that stuff is important, but nothing beats actually going out and talking to people and getting those insights, because, you know, insights on a bar graph, you can get some information from that, but it's those kind of little nuggets of advice that you can pick by speaking to, say, potential customers or suppliers or other people who are doing similar things that are really valuable.
Yeah, and I guess particularly sort of if you're in a local market as well, you know, you're understanding what's happening in that region or sort of in that locality. And I mean, if we've got sort of current students and we've got graduates watching this, it's just a reminder. We'll ping it up on the screen. You know, when we publish the podcast, you can access all of that support from the enterprise team at the University of Huddersfield on a lifelong basis now, which is quite nice. So we will make sure we share those details on the podcast too. This has sort of brought us really nicely to the end of the podcast, James. I mean, we could have talked for much longer, but we are on limited time. So if anyone's been watching this, any current students, University of Huddersfield graduates, or any other interested parties that might want to get in touch with you or reach out off the back of this, what's the best way to get in touch?
Probably find me on LinkedIn and send me a message on there. It's James Mulvany. I guess you can put a thing up on the bottom. If you go to jamesm.com, there's a link on my website, which goes to my LinkedIn and the social profiles. And feel free to send me a message if you want to chat or you want to go for a coffee or something. Say I'm in Manchester, so I'm not a million miles away from Huddersfield. And always happy to talk to kind of people who are aspiring entrepreneurs or have got business ideas.
Fab, that's great. Yeah, we will ping those up on the screen. And at Manchester, lots of great coffee places in Manchester. So worth taking that offer up. James, thanks so much for your time. Thanks so much for your insights. Thank you for becoming another member of the Hud Grad Club. And we wish you obviously the best of luck with everything moving forward with the business.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Great to speak to you.
Take care. All the best. Enjoyed the podcast? Then go to the University of Huddersfield YouTube channel for all of our future episodes. Subscribe, like, and don't forget to hit the bell button for notifications. If you'd like to be involved in the Hud Grad Club podcast moving forward, please get in touch with us on alumni@hud.ac.uk.